Good evening, and welcome to the Central Arkansas Library System's Six Bridges Book Festival. I'm Tom DeBlack, and we're delighted to have as our guest this evening, Edward Ball. Mr. Ball was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1958, raised in Charleston, South Carolina, Miami, and New Orleans. He attended Brown University, graduated in 1982, and settled in New York City, where he became a freelance journalist, writing for newspapers and magazines. His first book, Slaves in the Family, was an account of his family's history as slaveholders in South Carolina, and it received the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 1998. Edward has written 6 books of narrative nonfiction, telling stories about film history, genetics, sex reassignment, enslavement, Black family history, and white supremacy. His Life of a Klansman, published in June 2020, tells the story of a warrior in the Ku Klux Klan. Edward's great-great-grandfather, a carpenter in Louisiana, who took up the cause of fanatical racism during the years after the Civil War. Edward Ball is taught at Yale University and the State University of New York. He's been awarded fellowships by the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard and the New York Public Library's Cullman Center. And he's also the recipient of the Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome, Edward Ball.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be with you.
We're going to ask you to, if you would, just to read a brief excerpt from your book to start us off, and then I'll ask you some questions.
Oh, that sounds good. Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you. This is the book that it took me about 5 years to write. And I thought I would read 3 minutes from the very first pages of the book, which give a sense of where it heads. Page 1. My mother had a soft view of the person who became our Klansman. He was the one with the pretty name, she said, Constant Lecorne. Who can pronounce that? I said. He was French, and no one in New Orleans is French anymore. This talk took place in the kitchen. I was a teenager. His name was unusual, my mother said. Polycarp Constant Lecorne. She pronounced the last part, Lecorne. She said the middle name with a French effort, Constant. What kind of a name is that? Polycarp Constant. It's pretty. My mother's name was Janet. She thought it was plain, whereas this family member, the one called Polycarp, had a fancy name, and he was French, meaning Latin, meaning more cultured, more virile, or something. Polycarp Constant Lecorne, she said. It's like a melody. It's strange, I said. Look it up. I went away to page through an encyclopedia, came back to report. Polycarp was a saint. About AD 100 in the city of Smyrna on the Mediterranean. He was a bishop killed by the Romans. Our Polycarp was Catholic, my mother said. He did not like his first name, so he used his second, Constant. He was not a saint. What do you mean? I mean, it is too bad what he got up to with that White League. I mean, it is sweet and bitter. The beautiful name, the business with the Ku Klux. This is a story that begins with a woman making notes and talking about family and ends with a lot of people dead in a ditch. This is a family story, yet it is not a family story wrapped in sugar the way some people like to serve them. Constant Lecorne was a family hero of sorts. That is, he was a hero before standards changed and his memory became too hot. Then he was forgotten deliberately. He was a hero because he fought for whiteness, for our tribe. And if you measure the results, he won. There is a Creole saying, on lave son linge sale en famille. Wash your dirty laundry inside the family, meaning keep quiet about the bad stories, show no conflict, say nothing that dirties reputation. The adage is a reminder always to disguise. I want to tell the story of this ordinary man with the unusual name because he helped to lay out and to tend the garden of whiteness in which we dwell. The story of Constant Lecorne offers a glimpse down the damp hall of American history where the Ku Klux Klan is a perennial mold in the national house. It spread first during Reconstruction, the 12 years that followed the Civil War. This was the start of the Ku Klux, the movement in which my predecessor Constant Lecorne played his part. By 1880, the fungus vanished, cleared by its own success in winning back white supremacy after years when whiteness looked weak. Our Klansman was not a leader, but a follower, a foot soldier, and his story is not rare. Violent white supremacy is a populist phenomenon with many in the rank and file and few leaders. Anyone who thinks that to have a Klansman among one's relatives is a strange or deviant thing may be surprised by the reality. In 1925, the Ku Klux Klan could claim 5 million members, white and Christian. It's likely that leaders of the movement exaggerated their numbers for publicity reasons. Let's assume that actual Klan membership stood at 4 million. Take 4 million Klansmen, people on the march in 1925, and estimate the number of their descendants. Count forward 100 years to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. By a good formula in demography, the 4 million Klansmen of 1925 has as their direct descendants in 2025 about 137 million living white Americans. 137 million people comprise 1/2 of the white population of the United States. 50% of whites can claim a family link to the Ku Klux. 1/2 of whites in the US could, if they wished, write a Klan family memoir. Of course, one has to know the names of a few ancestors and want to find out about their lives. I'll stop there. That's the way the book begins, and then it goes on to tell the story of a man who lived and died in the 19th century in New Orleans. Tom, thank you for joining me with this audience. I'm really happy that you got interested in this story.
Well, again, we're delighted to have you. And I told Edward earlier that I had used his previous book, Slaves and the Family, in a New South class that I taught at Arkansas Tech. So father's family in Charleston and your mother's family in New Orleans, you really had the old Deep South bracketed geographically. And of course, the story from your father's side was considerably different from this one. And while you found out about Constant Lecorne as a young man from Maud, you said in the book and in interviews I've watched that you were initially reluctant to get too deeply into it. Could you talk about that a minute?
Yes. Well, I did learn about this man from the genealogist in my mother's family in New Orleans. Maud Lecorne was her name. And I heard about him when I was a child growing up there in the late 1960s from her. But as time passed and as the white South, including our family in New Orleans, began to rethink its family history, the story of our Klansman was not one that was told at the dinner table. It was not one that was celebrated. As many of us, I'm sure, know, the Ku Klux was an organization that was held in high regard for generations in the Deep South. And the exploits, the campaigns, the nighttime maraudings of the gangs in which my ancestor took part were commemorated in public ceremonies on an annual basis for many decades. But after the Civil Rights Movement, a kind of what I would call white memory, white historical memory, white collective memory began to get reconfigured, and a curtain was drawn over these sorts of stories, and I was afraid to touch it because I thought it was ugly. I thought it was caustic. I thought it was poisonous. And at a certain point, I decided that I should look up close at the hard truths. And so I took a deep breath and I started to research this man's life.
Bit me a historian's question here. You say in the book that you originally considered writing a novel because there was not a lot of good resource material. There were no letters, there were no diaries. You had to rely heavily on, often on indirect evidence. And some of that's pretty easy. You knew they lived in a certain place in New Orleans, so it's pretty obvious that he was familiar with Mardi Gras. Where he lived, he was familiar with the goings-on in Congo Square. And you have arrest records from the attack on the 7th Precinct Police Station and an indictment. So you knew he was there and involved in that. But in other places, the direct evidence is sparse or even non-existent, and you had to sort of make an educated guess as to whether he was at a certain event at a certain time. Can you talk to me about the process of how you make that call? How do you decide, well, there's enough evidence to say he was there, and well, I can't make that statement?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things going on. One is that this is the story of a manual laborer who, like 990 out of 1,000 of us, left no personal record of any kind. However, his footprint did come into shape in public records of all kinds: property records, sacramental records of the Catholic Church, the census records, records of local organizations like the fire department, property records from the notarial archives of the city of New Orleans. So there were traces, like a shadow trace, of where he came and went. But that's one aspect, is the scarcity of evidence for the majority of humanity. And the other aspect is that the people involved in race violence, in attacks conducted at night under disguise, were overall not willing to keep records of their activities, and they didn't announce what they were up to, and they didn't publish bragging memoirs about it. In fact, their desire was to go anonymously and not to be recognized. And throughout, the history of gang mob violence in this country, which is a long one, the same state of affairs pertains. So I relied on a lot of circumstantial evidence to place my character, my ancestor, in certain places and times. So, for example, there was an event called the Mechanics Institute Massacre in 1866 in New Orleans, during which a couple of hundred African Americans were meeting to agitate for the right to vote. And the white mayor of New Orleans, this is a year after the end of the Civil War, sent the city police and fire departments to this meeting to break up the meeting. Now, it happens that the fire departments were the hotbeds and the kind of nursing chambers for Ku Klux Klan militias, and my protagonist was active in one of those fire departments. And all of the fire departments showed up with the police force, and in 2 hours' time, there were about 200 Black people dead in the streets of New Orleans. Now, I don't have the fingerprints of my ancestor at that event, but I have what I consider to be the preponderance of evidence that he participated in this massacre. As you notice, probably, Tom, that when I make these narrative claims, I say in the book, this is what I think happened, and these are the circumstances under which I think it happened. In other cases, I'll refer specifically to records of events that are clearly documented by paper evidence as events that are unmistakably. But I think that the standard is a preponderance of evidence.
Right, and it's an amazing accomplishment to produce a work like you did without access to those gold mines that historians look for in diaries and letters. And you alluded to this in what you just said, but there's a distinction they made, and you talk about it in the book, between the Petit Blanc and the Grand Blanc. And while he was a Petit Blanc, there were Grand Blancs in the family. Is that correct?
That's right. The little whites and the big whites in Creole society and in Francophone, French-speaking white Creole society in Louisiana, there was a strict class division between propertied whites, Grand Blanc, and unpropertied whites, Petit Blanc. And the family of the Lecornes, my ancestor Constant, experienced a class decline over the period of the 1800s. They were Grand Blanc in the 1820s, 30s. They owned two or three small plantations and had enslaved approximately 20 African Americans. But by 1850, they had lost much of their entitlement, much of their status, and my ancestor was raised in this dimming light of class decline in the years before the Civil War, and he became a manual laborer. So by the time he was 30 years old, much of the family were working as seamstresses, the women, and as carpenters or mill workers, or cotton traders at a small level. So they were Petit Blanc at the time that the Ku Klux Klan arose and the Lecornes became active in the Ku Klux.
You talk about the fact that there's a tendency to lump all this in as Ku Klux Klan. But you talk about the fact that there are really other white supremacist organizations, the Knights of the White Camellia, the White League, and there were some distinctions. And I think I think it may have been Maud, I don't remember, that told you what the difference was. We think everyone's going around with hoods and robes, and that just wasn't the case.
That's right. Yeah. Well, the Ku Klux arises in 1866 or early 1867 in Pulaski, Tennessee, among a group of Confederate veterans, men of education, actually, who formed the first Ku Klux circle. And the idea catches on like fire and spreads throughout the South, so that by 1868, there are tens of thousands of Ku Klux cells from South Carolina to Georgia, across Alabama and Mississippi, and northern Louisiana. Northern Louisiana was rife with Ku Klux violence. Southern Louisiana, which was the Catholic part of Louisiana, was somehow decided, the whites of the South in Louisiana created their own groups with different names for various reasons. And one of them was the Knights of the White Camellia. And it appears that Constant Lecorne, my great-great-grandfather, was in that group. A family friend ran that group, a guy called Alcibiades de Blanc. And a year later, he was in another group called the McHenry Militia. And these groups, they did disguise, but they didn't use hoods and robes as people think about Klan marauders today. They took old work clothes and covered them with embroidered stars and emblems, and they took an old meal sack and cut holes in it and stuck it on their head, and their wives might have embroidered it with some sort of design. It was later, it was 50 years later, that the white sheets and white hoods became the common uniform of the Ku Klux. My Aunt Maud LaCorn, who knew about these things intimately, she was a granddaughter of Constant LaCorn, said, you know, the White League, the only thing different about the White League, between the White League and the Ku Klux, is that the White League operated out in the open. They abandoned anonymity, and they were proud enough and strong enough to operate in the open. So by the time that my ancestor got into the White League, this was, I don't know, 1873, I think. It was 7 years after the end of the Civil War. The militias, the paramilitary subversive movement that was Ku Klux activity was so strong and so popular that White League members did not have to disguise themselves, and they could parade and drill in the streets and conduct their business without fear of being arrested.
There are a lot of interesting characters in the book, but one of the most interesting characters to me is New Orleans itself.
Yeah.
We all say New Orleans is not like anywhere else. And it really wasn't like anywhere else, it seems to me, during Reconstruction. Can you talk about how unique the situation was in New Orleans?
I can do that. I'm pretty sure that many folks in this room have spent some time in New Orleans. If you could throw your mind back 150 years, it looked something like this. A quarter of the population, let's say there are 250,000 people in New Orleans 150 years ago. A quarter of the population is French-speaking white Creole, descendants of the original French settlers. A quarter of the population are newly freed African Americans who had been enslaved for generations on sugar plantations and in kitchens, and they're English speaking. A quarter of the population are French speaking Creoles of color. That is to say, mixed race, light-skinned African Americans who speak French and who are the children and grandchildren of interracial romances and interracial rape that was widespread and characteristic of Louisiana society, that created a large class of prosperous mixed race people. And it's a mélange society that's going all kinds of different ways. And a quarter of the population is white, working class, English speaking, boatmen and carpenters and porters and streetcar operators and teachers. So it's a mélange. And running through this mixed society is carnival, which is the glue that holds all of it together. Everyone is participating in carnival for 4 months out of the year. And it's the idea of masking and of turning the world upside down is the kind of shared pleasure of society, high and low, from newly freed enslaved people to the French-speaking property owner at the top of the span. So it's an unusual place. It's not like any other place in America, and to an extent, it's still an unusual city.
Like so many young Southern men, with the outbreak of the Civil War, Constant Lecointe enlists in the Confederate Army.
Yeah.
Is sent north. He gets, well, let's just say he gets in some trouble before he actually sees his first fight. He actually gets sent home. Re-enlists later. And you talk about the fact that he was not a particularly good soldier at first, but by the end of the war, he's become something of a rather good soldier. To what do you attribute that? And how does this Civil War experience color his post-war activities?
Yeah. He's one of 4 brothers, born and raised in New Orleans. He was 31, I think, when Fort Sumter erupts in Charleston Harbor, and he immediately enlists along with 50,000 other white Louisianians, and he goes off to fight in Virginia. But along the way, he gets involved in a drunken mutiny that his company manages to stage, and he's thrown out of the army. He goes back to New Orleans in 1862, and in summer 1862, the Yankees come up the Mississippi River and seize New Orleans. And Constant is there with his wife, Gabrielle Duchemin, and their 2 children. And he is alarmed and ashamed, and he sneaks out of the city at night with a friend and finds his way to a Confederate camp in the middle of the state, and re-enlists in the Confederate Army. And he spends the next 2.5 years going from northern Louisiana to southern Louisiana to Arkansas to back into northern Louisiana, zigzagging in firefight after firefight, never getting hurt, while his friends around him are always getting killed. And his brother, Joseph, is fighting simultaneously in Alabama, and then in Georgia, and then in Tennessee, and he's captured and thrown into a prisoner of war camp in Ohio. So the men in the family are up to their necks in the rebellion. At the end of the war, both Constant and his brother return to New Orleans in spring 1865. His brother Joseph is released from the POW camp, and he makes his way down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi, and Constant surrenders in upstate Louisiana and makes his way down the river, and they arrive in New Orleans. And I imagine, and I think we have to imagine ourselves into the minds of people who preceded us. We have to try to imagine what they experienced, what they felt. I imagine that these 2 men and tens of thousands of men like them were full of bitterness and resentment and rage when they came back from the war. And these 2 men found their city, which is now full of African Americans recently freed from slavery. And they found their city, which now provided much less of an income for them. Constant was unable to make a good living as a carpenter. And this rage was suppressed only for a short period of time before it was translated into and directed into the paramilitary groups that we know as the Ku Klux.
One of the things that stands out to me, you just can't escape it, and it's something which modern people are not so much accustomed, but the incredibly high infant and child mortality rate.
Yeah.
and particularly New Orleans outbreaks of yellow fever. And this leads to one of the more unique names in the book, a child that they call Eve, Y-V-E-S, Eve of God. Can you talk about Eve of God just a minute?
Sure. Eve of God, Yves Jean de Dieu was his given name. This was the oldest surviving son of Constant's parents. Constant, as I said, has 4 brothers. He has 2 sisters. And his parents were French. His dad was a French immigrant. His mother was a member of a family in a propertied family that was in decline. And when they married in the 18 teens in New Orleans, they began to have children, and their first 4 children died in infancy. And it wasn't until their 5th child, whom they named Eve of God, that they succeeded in starting a family. So, as you say, Tom, yellow fever and malaria and cholera and other pandemics swept away tens of thousands of people every decade and a half in Louisiana. New Orleans was on the front line of these epidemics because it was a port city, and there was a massive yellow fever outbreak in 1853 that killed something like 30,000 people in Louisiana, and some of the Licorns died. So it was a different relationship that people had to, how can we say, to catching a cold. There was a tremendous amount of fear in everyday life that one was going to, from one day to the next, one could be swept into the grave. And Constant and his wife, Gabrielle, over a period of 20 years, have 9 children. 5 of them die in diseases of different kinds. Tuberculosis was one that killed their 11-year-old daughter. So it's, if we imagine ourselves into that time, we can also imagine fear that accompanied everyday life. And it's certainly relevant today.
Constant dies in 1886, I believe. 6 years later, Homer Plessy is arrested in New Orleans, riding a white. He was a man of color, but very light skinned, arrested for riding a streetcar in New Orleans. 1896, 10 years after Constant's death, we get the landmark Plessy v. Ferguson case. And you say, and I think you said earlier tonight, this Constant and his comrades lost the Civil War, but they really won Reconstruction, it seems. And that was true not only here, but in New Orleans, but throughout the South. They eventually won.
Yeah, I see it that way. The Ku Klux arises as a guerrilla movement to resist the campaign that we call Reconstruction. Reconstruction was an effort by Washington to create a society that was multi-racial and had greater greater access to property, to education, that reached across the races. It was a terrifically difficult thing to attempt and accomplish in the aftermath of enslavement, where in spring 1865, 4 million Black people leave enslavement. Many of them leave the plantations where they are they were formerly in bondage and come to the towns and cities of the South. And the Ku Klux arises exactly at the time when Black men are given the right to vote for the first time. The Ku Klux arises exactly at the time when Black people are able to take out loans and start small businesses. It arrives exactly at the time when the segregation laws are hammered into place. And if you take the longer view, Reconstruction lasts for 12 years. The Ku Klux fights throughout those 12 years until 1876, when the federal government kind of throws in the towel and says, after a series of street fights and massacres, agrees to withdraw the Union Army remnant that is in the southern states. And at that point, all of the mixed race, all of the interracial governments of the South fall, and white command is returned, is achieved again. So the Ku Klux actually wins the fight, and Jim Crow segregation is established and survives for another 100 years until 1965 or so, when the civil rights movement manages to accomplish its greatest victories in the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and legislation of that kind. So I'm taking the longer view, and I don't know if you agree, Tom, but that's the way I see it.
I do agree. As a matter of fact, one of the things, Edward, that I found most interesting about slaves and the family, and also about Life of a Klansman, was your discussion of the reaction to your book, of the reaction from your family and the reaction from those outside the family. Could you talk a little bit about that as it relates to this book, Life of a Klansman?
Yeah. Excuse me. Well, my first book, Slaves in the Family, was about my father's family in South Carolina, who controlled some 20 rice plantations and enslaved some 4,000 people over a period of 175 years. And I told that story in a way that brought Black people into the narrative, so that it was not only about the slave holders, but it was a story of the people that we'd enslaved. And my father's family, many of them still live in South Carolina, more than 120, I think. And this was controversial. It was painful for many of us. And it took years. This was 20 years ago. It took years for some of those family wounds to begin to heal. This book is set in New Orleans. My mother's family, who have been in that city for 200 years and who have been largely working people, no one with a college education until the 1960s and 70s. And it's turned out a little different. I've told this story of our Klansman, but it hasn't created as much strain as I thought it might. A number of us in the family, there are about 40 or 50 cousins of mine in New Orleans and in Louisiana. A number of us were not aware of this Klansman's story in any detail. And it seems almost remote to many folks in the family. I think that there's a reflex that many of us have, which is to say, oh, that's the bad apple. He's the racist. That's the racist. Now we're different. It's that group the Ku Klux, those are the real racists, but we're not that person. We're different. So it hasn't been that controversial. It's not exactly, it is painful for many of us to hear stories that that our family was involved in night riding and marauding against African Americans, and yet it I still have a lot of friends in the family.
How about outside the family? What kind of reaction have you gotten from outside the family?
For this book,
Yes.
Life of a Klansman?
Yes. And I'm interested particularly in what happened at Tulane in August.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's, I find that people are interested in this story, but once in a while, there's a knee-jerk reaction. So I was scheduled to talk at Tulane back in August, and this alarmed a lot of students at Tulane, apparently, and there was a campaign to troll, perhaps that's not the right verb. There was a campaign to denounce me and to denounce the event in which I was scheduled to talk. And so the president of Tulane and the provost and the dean were all subjected to hundreds of emails from students who said, absolutely, it's not right for a descendant of a Klansman to talk to us about white supremacy. It's just not right. And so the administration canceled my appearance there. And then the next thing that happened was that there's a magazine called Reason, which is a libertarian magazine. And they got in touch and they did a big feature about this little episode. And the next thing that happened is that Fox News got in touch, and they said, we have this show, it's called Fox and Friends, and we want you to make a statement about what it's like to be a free speech martyr. And so I said, all right, well, no, thank you. I mean, it's not something that I want to fan the flames of. And so the conflict passed. And Tulane is right now sort of planning another event where I will actually go through it and give a talk about this book.
Good. When I read that back in August, I sort of had the same feeling that I had later when I saw that protesters had torn down a statue of Abraham Lincoln. Because having read Slaves in the Family, I knew where you came down on the issue of race. I just thought that was incredibly strange. But I'm glad you're going back there. This book comes out, Edward, in probably one of the most contentious racial periods in our recent history. What relevance do you see for the book in these current times?
Yeah, excuse me. Well, I think about this book, the story of an obscure man, a nobody who happens to be a member of my family, as a kind of origin story for white supremacy. It's about how it is born, how it grows up in the late 1800s, how it is refined, and how it is exported to the rest of the country to become a national habit. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s is a national institution with millions of dues-paying followers in every state in the country. And excuse me, it's It's remarkable, in a way, that the events of the past 5 or 6 years so much resemble the events of Reconstruction in the Deep South. For example, in the past 5 years, there has been a resurgence of paramilitary white supremacist organizations, coast to coast, many of them in Texas and in the Northwest. The Proud Boys, the Michigan Wolverines, the Three Percenters. These are people who drill and who conduct themselves quite similarly as the Ku Klux predecessors, whom I assume they look towards for an ideal to emulate. In the past 5 years, about 250 people have died in mass shootings and white supremacist violence, from El Paso to Poway, California, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Cleveland. And in many of those cases, these murderers have accompanied their acts with manifestos that declare their supremacist ideology. So perhaps it's like an echo chamber. I think the stories in this book have a kind of resonance with things that are going on today. I think that the door was thrown open to white supremacy in 2015 with the Charleston massacre at Emmanuel African American Methodist Episcopal Church, when a 21-year-old man killed 9 African Americans at a prayer meeting. And since then, it has flooded back into the public sphere. I think that the next few years, we're going to see white supremacy pushed back underground. I think and hope that it will be. The signs are increasingly good that there will be a turn in the politics of our national life.
One of the questions we're getting from our chat room deals with class. I know that during the Civil War, oftentimes units, at least initially, were made up of that petit blanc class, but led by someone from the upper classes. Was that equally true with the organizations in New Orleans? How much
it was, yes. They were. It was a rich man's militia and a poor man's fight. The Klan militias, in general, were led by people who were educated and sometimes published and propertied, and the actual campaigns of marauding were conducted by working men, and so it's true. I think that we can say that, just as the Civil War itself was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
One of the other questions we're getting on the chat is talks about the differences between North Louisiana and the New Orleans area. And the questioner wants to know, did the KKK flourish in northern Louisiana because New Orleans is predominantly Catholic? Was there a religious aspect to this?
I think that that's a good explanation for the reason the southern Louisiana parishes produced their own militias with new names. The northern Louisiana parishes were Protestant, Baptist dominated, and below Baton Rouge, the parishes are more Catholic. And there was, even in the earliest years, there was a kind of Protestant chauvinism among Klan members. It was a point of pride that they were Presbyterians and Baptists and Lutherans and other faiths, and they were skeptical of Catholics. 50 years later, when the Ku Klux is revived, it's an explicitly anti-Catholic organization. It's a Protestant supremacist organization that disdains Catholics. So I think that helps to explain the split in northern and southern Louisiana. The southern militias are doing the same things as the Ku Klux in the northern parishes, but they're calling themselves different names.
Another question I asked, and you've alluded to this, but I'll ask it again. Was it painful to learn of your ancestors' involvement with white supremacy, personally?
Painful, but not surprising. As I mentioned, if we look as white people at our family tree up close, we are likely to find, many of us, active white supremacists in our family tree. It's a fact. And so, yeah, it's painful to know, but what I want to do is not to shun this story and, point accusingly at this man and his depravity, but to say this is in a difficult to understand and accept, in a way that is difficult to understand and accept. His life has a relationship with my life and the lives of many people that I don't know. In other words, here's the hard part. I think that the actions of violent white supremacists generations ago have, in a distant but genuine way, helped to clear space for the lives of white people today, because they are the troops that police the boundaries of white society and they were the troops that tried to establish and reassert white domination, and they succeeded. So in a real way, this obscure, violent man who undertook detestable things has softened my life today. That's the hard thing to acknowledge, to accept, and to come to terms with.
You mentioned earlier, your family has roots in two of the most significant southern cities, and that you've been gone from the South for almost 4 decades now, I suppose. Do you still feel any affinity for the region, any ties?
Oh yeah, sure. I get before the pandemic, I'm in Charleston and in New Orleans several times a year, and even after 4 decades, I miss the Deep South truly, and I feel conflicted about having made the decision to leave and to live in the Northeast, which is where I've been for some time. So yeah, I miss the South, and it's in my soul.
We're about out of time, but I'd like to ask you this: what's next for Edward Ball?
Well, I'm working on a new book, but I mean that's what I tell my agent. I'm working on a new book, and it doesn't have a shape yet, and it doesn't have a publisher. And I can't go on into it right now, but if you hang in there for another couple of years, I'll have something else to show. I'm sorry to be evasive, but that's, I guess writers are slippery.
I'm encouraged that you've got something else out there on the horizon, because I strongly would recommend this book as well as Slaves and the Family.
Thank you.
And it's been our pleasure to have you this evening. And thanks to all of you for participating. You can find a copy of Life of a Klansman at Wordsworth Books. And I would recommend it as an excellent Christmas gift. And if you haven't read Slaves and the Family, by all means, read that as well. Edward Ball, thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure, Tom. Pleasure to be with you, and have a good evening.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you.